1274 BC, the plains of Kadesh in modern-day Syria. The greatest chariot battle in ancient history was about to unfold, and it would reveal a terrifying truth that military commanders had been ignoring for decades. Infantry, the backbone of every ancient army, had become obsolete, or so everyone thought. Rameses II, pharaoh of Egypt, 24 years old and hungry for glory, was leading his army of 20,000 men north into Hittite territory. He wanted to reclaim the city of Kadesh, a strategic fortress that controlled the trade routes between Egypt and Mesopotamia. But Rameses had made a critical mistake. He believed his own intelligence reports. 2 Bedouin deserters had told him that the Hittite king, Muwatalli sect, was still far to the north near Aleppo, too afraid to face Egyptian might. Rameses believed them. He pushed his army forward in 4 separate divisions, each named after a god: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Seth. The divisions were spread out over miles of territory, a textbook violation of military doctrine that would nearly cost Egypt everything. What Rameses didn't know was that those 2 Bedouin weren't deserters. They were spies, and Muwatalli wasn't cowering in Aleppo. He was waiting just beyond the hills east of Kadesh with the largest chariot force ever assembled. 3,500 chariots, each one carrying 3 men, a driver, a warrior with a spear, and an archer. Over 10,000 chariot crew in total, supported by another 37,000 infantry from across the Hittite Empire and their allied kingdoms. The chariot had dominated Near Eastern warfare for over 300 years. It wasn't just a weapons platform, it was a psychological weapon that shattered enemy formations before a single spear was thrown. The sound alone was devastating. Hundreds of horses thundering across the battlefield, wheels grinding against earth, warriors screaming war cries. Infantry who stood their ground against a chariot charge were either incredibly brave or suicidally stupid. Usually both. The impact was brutal. Horses crashed into shield walls at full gallop. Chariots crushed men under their wheels. Spears thrust downward from elevated positions, finding gaps in armour and shields. And then came the arrows. Composite bows firing from moving platforms, raining death on soldiers who couldn't run fast enough to escape. Egyptian chariots were lighter than their Hittite counterparts, designed for speed and maneuverability. They carried 2 men, a driver and an archer. The composite bow was the primary weapon, capable of piercing bronze armour at 100 yards. Egyptian chariot doctrine emphasized mobility: strike fast, withdraw, reload, strike again. They were the ancient equivalent of cavalry raiders, designed to harass and disrupt rather than engage in sustained combat. Hittite chariots were different, heavier, built for shock and impact. 3 men per chariot meant more combat power but less speed. The 3rd man carried a long spear, perfect for close combat after the initial charge broke enemy lines. Hittite tactics were about overwhelming force: mass the chariots, charge in formation, smash through infantry, then wheel around for another pass while the foot soldiers finished off the survivors. Rameses was leading his Amun division toward Kadesh, confident and completely unaware of the catastrophe racing toward him. His Ra division was about a mile behind. The Ptah and Seth divisions were even further back, separated by hours of marching. The Egyptian army was strung out like beads on a thread, vulnerable and exposed. Military genius it was not. The Hittite scouts had been tracking Egyptian movements for days. Muwatalli knew exactly where each division was, how fast they were moving, and most importantly where they would be most vulnerable. He positioned his massive chariot force east of Kadesh, hidden behind the hills, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when Rameses and the Amun division crossed the Orontes River and began setting up camp northwest of Kadesh. The Rear division was still crossing the river, exposed and spread thin. The other 2 divisions hadn't even reached the river yet. Muwatalli gave the order. 3,500 Hittite chariots surged forward. The scouts had done their job perfectly. The chariots emerged from behind the hills and slammed into the Rear division while they were mid-crossing. The impact was catastrophic. Egyptian infantry, caught in marching formation with shields on their backs and spears bundled, had no chance. The front ranks simply ceased to exist. Crushed under hooves and wheels, impaled on spears, trampled into the mud. The soldiers in the rear ranks saw what was coming and ran. There was no shame in running from a chariot charge. Staying meant certain death. The Ra division disintegrated in minutes. Some men threw down their weapons and sprinted toward the Amun division's camp, screaming warnings. Others jumped into the river and drowned in their armor. The survivors, and there weren't many, scattered across the plains. The Hittite chariots didn't stop. They wheeled north toward Ramesses' camp, where the Amun division was just realizing something had gone catastrophically wrong. Ramesses was in his tent when the first refugees from the Ra division came stumbling into camp, bleeding and terrified. The young pharaoh, who minutes earlier had been planning his triumphant entry into Kadesh, now faced annihilation. The Hittite chariot force, barely slowed by their destruction of the Ra division, was bearing down on his position. The Amun division tried to form defensive lines, but they were in camp formation, not battle formation. Tents everywhere, supplies scattered, chariots not yet harnessed, infantry without their shields properly positioned. The Hittite chariots hit the camp like a tidal wave. 3,500 chariots, organized into squadrons of 50, crashed through the Egyptian perimeter from the south and east. The Egyptian infantry, what little had managed to grab weapons and form up, was swept away. Shield walls collapsed, spearmen were ridden down. The famous Egyptian discipline drilled into soldiers through endless training evaporated under the sheer terror of mass chariot assault. This is where understanding ancient warfare becomes critical. Modern people imagine ancient battles as organized affairs with clear lines and tactical formations. Reality was far messier. When 3,000 chariots hit your position simultaneously, tactics become irrelevant. It's not a battle, it's a stampede. Egyptian soldiers weren't cowards. They were human beings facing an unstoppable mechanical force that their training hadn't prepared them for. Running wasn't weakness. It was the only rational response. Ramesses found himself in the middle of a collapsing army. His bodyguard, the elite troops who were supposed to die protecting him, were dying, just not protecting him. They were dying in general chaos, pulled from their chariots, speared, trampled, scattered. The Pharaoh of Egypt, god-king of the Nile, master of the two lands, was about to become a Hittite trophy. The Egyptian records carved into temple walls across Egypt describe what happened next as divine intervention. The god Amun appeared to Ramesses and gave him the strength of 1,000 men. The pharaoh single-handedly rallied his troops, mounted his chariot, and charged into the Hittite formations, scattering them like chaff. 6 times he charged. 6 times he emerged victorious. The Hittites fled in terror before the divinely empowered pharaoh. Egypt was saved by the personal heroism of Ramesses the Great. That's the propaganda version. Here's what probably actually happened. Ramesses, trapped and desperate, did what any competent commander would do in that situation. He gathered every chariot crew he could find, maybe 50 chariots, maybe less, and counterattacked. Not because he was divinely inspired, but because sitting still meant certain death. The counterattack wasn't heroic. It was necessary. And it probably would have failed completely except for 2 factors the Egyptian propaganda doesn't mention, because they complicate the narrative of pharaonic supremacy. First, the Hittite chariots had gotten greedy. After smashing through the Egyptian camp, the chariot crews had stopped to loot. This wasn't unusual. Ancient armies didn't have supply chains like modern militaries. Soldiers were often expected to support themselves through plunder. The Hittite chariot warriors, seeing an Egyptian royal camp full of gold, silver, weapons and supplies, couldn't resist. They broke formation and started grabbing everything valuable they could carry. Discipline collapsed into a looting free-for-all. Second, and far more important, the Nearin arrived. The Nearin were a force of Egyptian allies or possibly mercenaries, the historical record isn't entirely clear, who had been marching on a parallel route along the coast. They numbered around 5,000 men with their own chariot contingent. They reached the battlefield from the northwest just as the Hittite chariots were scattered across the Egyptian camp, their crews dismounted and stuffing loot into their vehicles. The Nearin charged into the Hittite rear. Suddenly, the unstoppable chariot force was caught between Ramesses' desperate counterattack from the east and fresh troops hitting them from the northwest. The Hittite chariots, overextended and disorganized, were now the vulnerable ones. The trap had reversed. Chariot crews who had dismounted to loot were caught on foot and killed. Chariots trying to reform were hit by Egyptian arrows before they could build up speed. The Hittite advantage of mass and momentum had evaporated. Muwatalli, watching from his command position near Kadesh, saw his perfect ambush turning into a chaotic mess. He had options. He had his infantry, 37,000 strong who hadn't engaged yet. He could have committed them to finish what the chariots had started, but he didn't. The Hittite king chose to hold his infantry in reserve and recall his scattered chariot forces. This decision has puzzled historians for 3,000 years. Why didn't Muwatalli press his overwhelming numerical advantage? Several theories exist. Some historians argue that Muwatalli was cautious by nature and didn't want to risk his infantry in what had become an unpredictable melee. Others suggest he was worried about the approaching Egyptian Tar and Seth divisions, which would arrive eventually and could trap his army against the river. The most likely explanation is simpler. Muwatalli had achieved his strategic objective. He had shattered 2 of Egypt's 4 divisions and trapped the pharaoh's army north of Kadesh. He didn't need to risk more casualties to claim victory. As the sun set on that first day of battle, both sides pulled back to assess the carnage. The Egyptians had been devastated. The Ra division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The Amun division had been mauled, its camp destroyed, thousands killed or scattered. But Rameses was alive, and the core of his chariot force remained intact. The Tar and Seth divisions were approaching, having force-marched when they heard the sounds of battle. The Egyptian army was still in the field, battered but not destroyed. The Hittites had also taken losses, though far fewer. Several hundred chariots had been destroyed or captured during the confused fighting in the Egyptian camp. Chariot crews had been killed when caught looting. But Muwatalli's main force, both chariots and infantry, remained intact and positioned between the Egyptians and Kadesh. What happened over the next day is less clear. Both Egyptian and Hittite records become vague, which usually means nobody won decisively. There was more fighting. The Egyptian sources claim Rameses launched multiple attacks and drove the Hittites back into Kadesh. The Hittite sources, what little survived, suggest Muwatalli maintained control of the battlefield and Kadesh remained in Hittite hands. Both are probably partially true and partially propaganda. What we know for certain is this. Rameses withdrew south with his army. Kadesh remained under Hittite control. Both sides claimed victory. Both sides were lying. Rameses returned to Egypt and immediately commissioned monuments declaring his great triumph over the Hittites. Temple walls across Egypt were carved with scenes of the pharaoh single-handedly defeating the Hittite horde. The official account, the poem of Pentor and the bulletin texts, describe Rameses as a warrior without equal, personally killing thousands of enemies. It's propaganda, but it's telling propaganda. The emphasis in Egyptian records on Rameses's personal heroism suggests Egyptian commanders knew the battle had been a disaster from a tactical standpoint. They needed to reframe a near-catastrophic defeat as a heroic victory snatched from the jaws of doom through divine intervention and pharaonic courage. Muwatalli, for his part, claimed victory because Kadesh remained in Hittite hands and the Egyptian invasion had been repelled. Both rulers were spinning the outcome for domestic consumption. But here's what Kadesh actually revealed, and why it matters beyond just another ancient battle between empires. Kadesh demonstrated both the absolute dominance of chariot warfare and the beginning of its limitations. The Hittite chariot charge had destroyed the Ra division in minutes. No infantry formation in the ancient world could stand against mass chariots in open terrain. The psychological impact alone was devastating. Soldiers who had never faced a chariot charge would break and run before impact. Those who had faced it before knew running was the only way to survive. Yet the battle also showed chariots had vulnerabilities. They required open terrain. They needed space to build speed and maneuver. They were expensive to build and maintain. Each chariot required 2 or 3 horses, trained crews, constant maintenance, and support infrastructure. An army fielding 3,000 chariots needed at least 6,000 horses, plus spares, plus pack animals for supplies. Feeding that many horses required enormous logistical support. More importantly, Kadesh showed what happened when chariot formations lost cohesion. The moment Hittite crews dismounted to loot, they became as vulnerable as infantry. A chariot without speed was just an expensive cart. The Nearin had proven that even a dominant chariot force could be defeated if caught disorganized. Infantry commanders across the Near East were paying attention. The professional military class, the men who actually had to fight these battles, rather than commission monuments about them, were learning. Chariots were devastating, but not invincible. Discipline, terrain, and timing could neutralize them. Over the next century, infantry tactics would evolve specifically to counter chariot warfare. The first adaptation was defensive. Infantry learned to fight in deeper formations that could absorb chariot impact without collapsing completely. Instead of thin shield walls that shattered on contact, armies deployed in multiple ranks. The front ranks would be equipped with long spears, angled to impale horses. The ranks behind provided weight and support, preventing the front line from being pushed back. It wasn't pretty, and the front rank still died horribly, but the formation as a whole could survive. Terrain selection became critical. Infantry commanders stopped offering battle in open plains where chariots excelled. They chose ground with obstacles, rough terrain, broken ground, areas near forests or marshes where chariots couldn't maneuver, the ancient equivalent of choosing your ground and making the enemy come to you. If chariots had to slow down to navigate obstacles, they lost their primary advantage. Missile troops, archers and slingers became more important. A chariot charge was terrifying, but it took time to build momentum. Archers positioned behind infantry lines could pour arrows into charging chariots, killing horses and crew before impact. It required discipline to stand and shoot while 3-ton vehicles thundered toward you, but trained archers could devastate chariot formations. The most important adaptation was psychological. Infantry needed to be trained to face chariot charges without breaking. This wasn't about courage in the abstract. It was about repetitive drilling until muscle memory overrode panic. Soldiers were trained to hear the thunder of hooves and immediately move into defensive formation rather than run. Units that had faced chariots and survived gained invaluable experience that made them far more effective in subsequent battles. But all these adaptations had a critical requirement: time. An army needed time to deploy in proper formation, time to choose favourable ground, time to organise defences. That's what Rameses had failed to provide at Kadesh. His divisions were caught spread out in marching order, on ground chosen by the enemy. No amount of training or tactics could save infantry under those conditions. The aftermath of Kadesh reshaped Near Eastern politics. Neither Egypt nor the Hittite Empire could claim decisive victory, which meant both were weakened. For 16 years after Kadesh, Egypt and the Hittites skirmished along their border without either side gaining advantage. Rameses launched multiple campaigns into Syria. Muwatalli and his successor Hattusili III defended Hittite territory. Thousands died. Nothing changed. Then both empires faced a common problem. The Assyrians were rising in the east. The Sea Peoples were migrating and raiding in the west. Both Egypt and the Hittites needed peace with each other to face these new threats. In 1258 BC, Rameses and Hattusili signed the Treaty of Kadesh, one of the earliest surviving peace treaties in history. Copies were made in both Egyptian and Hittite, inscribed in silver and later carved in stone. The treaty established borders, mutual defense pacts, and extradition agreements. It acknowledged what Kadesh had proven. Neither empire could destroy the other through military force alone. The treaty is fascinating because it implicitly admits the stalemate. Neither side mentioned who won at Kadesh, because both sides claimed victory and neither wanted to relitigate it. Instead, they focused on practical arrangements. The border would run north of Kadesh, meaning it remained Hittite. But Egypt gained trade access and security guarantees. Rameses married a Hittite princess to seal the alliance. Politics and diplomacy had achieved what chariot charges couldn't. Kadesh's real significance extends far beyond the immediate political aftermath. It represented peak chariot warfare. The Hittites fielded the largest chariot force ever assembled in ancient history. They executed a near-perfect ambush against a divided enemy. They achieved everything chariot doctrine said they should achieve. And yet they didn't win decisively. The battle revealed that even under ideal conditions, chariots alone couldn't guarantee victory against a determined opponent with resources to continue fighting. This realization transformed military thinking. Commanders who had viewed chariots as invincible began seeing them as very powerful but specialized weapons that required proper support and conditions to be effective. The era of pure chariot armies began to end. Future armies would use chariots as shock troops and mobile missile platforms, but they would be integrated with infantry and cavalry rather than relied on exclusively. The social implications were enormous. Chariot warfare was aristocratic by nature. Chariots were expensive. Training took years. Only wealthy families could afford to maintain chariot corps. This made chariot warriors the military elite, a privileged class who dominated ancient armies and, by extension, ancient politics. If chariots were invincible, then the aristocratic warrior class was essential and irreplaceable. But Kadesh suggested otherwise. The Nearin, whose exact social status remains debated by historians, had changed the battle's outcome. Infantry, common soldiers from non-elite backgrounds, could matter. This wasn't the class revolution it would become in later centuries with Greek hoplites or Roman legionaries, but it was the beginning. Military effectiveness was starting to disconnect from social class. The technological trajectory was also changing. Metalworking was improving. Bronze was becoming more available and cheaper to produce. This meant better armour and weapons for infantry. A spearman in good bronze armour was far more effective against chariots than one in leather and wood. As infantry equipment improved, the relative advantage of chariots decreased. Horse. Breeding programs across the Near East were hitting biological limits. Chariot horses were selected for size, strength and temperament over centuries. By the time of Kadesh, they were about as good as Bronze Age breeding could make them. But there wasn't much room for further improvement without genetic understanding that wouldn't exist for millennia. Meanwhile, infantry weapons and tactics could still improve dramatically. The economic calculation was shifting. A single chariot with crew, horses and support might cost the equivalent of equipping 50 infantrymen. That made sense when the chariot was 10 times more effective than infantry. But if infantry could be trained and equipped to reduce that effectiveness gap, the math changed. 50 trained spearmen might not equal one chariot in open battle, but they could hold ground, garrison cities, and fight in terrain where chariots couldn't operate. Over the next 2 centuries after Kadesh, chariot warfare would continue, but its dominance would slowly erode. The Sea People's migrations and invasions around 1200 BC disrupted the palace economies that supported large chariot forces. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed the trade networks that supplied tin for bronze and the specialized workshops that built chariots. In the chaos, infantry became more important because they were simpler to equip and train. The rise of iron metallurgy accelerated this trend. Iron weapons and armor, once metallurgy improved enough to make them practical, were cheaper to produce than bronze. A society could arm far more soldiers with iron than bronze. This favored infantry over chariots. The specialized aristocratic warrior in his expensive chariot was less valuable than formations of well-equipped common soldiers. But we shouldn't overstate infantry's rise. Chariots remained important in Near Eastern warfare for centuries after Kadesh. The Assyrians built a military machine that integrated chariots, cavalry and infantry into combined arms forces that conquered most of the known world. Persian armies under Cyrus and Darius used chariots effectively. Even Alexander the Great faced chariot forces in his Asian campaigns. What changed was the relationship. Chariots went from being the dominant weapon that decided battles to being one weapon among many. Infantry learned that chariots could be countered, survived, and defeated. That psychological shift mattered more than any tactical innovation. Once soldiers knew chariots weren't invincible, commanders had to rethink how they used them. Kadesh also demonstrated the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance. Ramesses's fundamental mistake was believing false intelligence and advancing without proper scouting. The 2 Bedouin deserters had given him exactly the information he wanted to hear, that the enemy was far away and frightened. Rameses believed it because it confirmed his assumptions. This is a recurring pattern in military history, commanders hearing what they want to hear and making decisions based on wishful thinking rather than verified intelligence. Muwatalli's success came from superior intelligence gathering. Hittite scouts had tracked Egyptian movements for days. They knew where each division was, how fast they were moving, and where they would be vulnerable. This allowed the Hittites to position their force perfectly for maximum impact. The battle was won before the first chariot charged because Muwatalli had better information and used it more effectively. The contrast in command decisions is instructive. Rameses made several critical errors. He divided his army into separate divisions without maintaining contact between them. He advanced without adequate reconnaissance. He believed enemy deserters without verification. He camped in a vulnerable position. These weren't the mistakes of a stupid man. They were the mistakes of an overconfident young commander who believed his own propaganda about Egyptian supremacy. Muwatalli made better decisions, but not perfect ones. His ambush was brilliantly executed. His positioning of forces was excellent. His timing was perfect. But his decision not to commit his infantry when the Egyptian army was reeling remains questionable. Historians will debate this forever. Was it caution, strategic thinking, or a missed opportunity? We'll never know for certain because the Hittite records don't explain his reasoning in detail. What we can say is that both commanders faced the fog of war, the fundamental uncertainty of combat where information is incomplete, and decisions must be made quickly with life or death consequences. Rameses made worse decisions early and nearly paid the ultimate price. Muwatalli made better decisions, but perhaps too cautiously to achieve decisive victory. The battle's long-term influence on military thought is difficult to overstate. It became a case study in ancient military education. Egyptian officers studied it, obviously emphasizing Rameses's heroic recovery rather than his initial mistakes. Hittite officers studied it, presumably focusing on Muwatalli's successful ambush. Later empires, Assyrians, Persians, and Greeks, knew the story and drew lessons from it. The primary lesson was about coordination and timing. An army divided is an army defeated. Ramesses' 4 divisions, separately excellent units, became vulnerable when spread across miles of territory, unable to support each other. This principle would echo through military history. Napoleon's maxim about not dividing forces, German blitzkrieg doctrine about concentration of force, modern military emphasis on combined arms operations, all reflect lessons first demonstrated at Kadesh. The secondary lesson was about terrain and positioning. Muwatalli chose the battlefield and positioned his forces to maximize advantage. Rameses accepted battle on ground chosen by his enemy. In ancient warfare, where communication was difficult and repositioning was slow, initial positioning often determined outcomes. The general who controlled terrain selection and timing had enormous advantage. The third lesson was about intelligence and deception. The Hittites successfully deceived the Egyptians about their location and strength. This allowed them to achieve complete surprise. Meanwhile, Ramesses' failure to verify intelligence nearly cost him everything. These lessons about intelligence, counterintelligence, and deception remain relevant in modern warfare, but perhaps the most important lesson was about combined arms warfare. The battle showed that no single weapon system, however dominant, could guarantee victory alone. Chariots needed infantry support to hold ground. Infantry needed chariots for mobility and shock action. Missile troops needed both for protection. Success required coordinating different unit types to support each other. This principle would become fundamental to military thinking. The archaeological evidence from Kadesh is limited. The ancient city has been partially excavated, but much remains buried. We have no physical evidence from the battle itself, no mass graves, no abandoned weapons. Everything we know comes from textual sources, primarily Egyptian. The Hittite records, mostly administrative documents from their capital Hattusa, mention Kadesh but don't provide detailed battle accounts. This means we're seeing the battle through a propaganda lens. The Egyptian sources are explicitly propagandistic, carved on temple walls to glorify Rameses. They're valuable historical sources but obviously biased. We have to read between the lines, looking for what the propaganda accidentally reveals rather than what it claims. For example, the Egyptian texts emphasize repeatedly that Rameses was abandoned by his soldiers and fought alone except for divine assistance. This probably means his troops broke and ran, which was embarrassing enough that it had to be reframed as setting up Ramesses' solo heroics. The texts also mention the Nearin saving the day, but only briefly, because giving them too much credit would undermine the pharaoh's glory. The Hittite perspective is frustratingly sparse. We know they claimed victory because Kadesh remained theirs. We know they respected Egyptian military power enough to eventually seek peace. But we don't have detailed Hittite accounts of the battle, so we can't compare versions and triangulate toward what actually happened. Modern historians use several approaches to reconstruct probable events. Terrain analysis shows where forces could have deployed and moved. Experimental archaeology tests what ancient weapons and tactics could actually accomplish. Comparative analysis with other ancient battles provides context. And careful reading of propagandistic sources reveals details the authors didn't intend to share. The consensus reconstruction goes something like this. The Hittites ambushed a divided Egyptian army, destroying one division and scattering another. Ramesses' division was nearly destroyed in their camp. The pharaoh personally led a desperate counterattack with whatever forces he could rally. The arrival of the Nearin from an unexpected direction disrupted the Hittite attack. The Hittites pulled back rather than risk their infantry. The Egyptians were too damaged to pursue. Both sides regrouped, skirmished for another day, and then disengaged. Nobody won decisively. This reconstruction doesn't make anyone look particularly heroic, which is probably why both ancient sources spun it differently. But it fits the evidence and explains the aftermath. If Egypt had won decisively, Kadesh would have fallen. If the Hittites had won decisively, Rameses would have died or been captured. Instead, both armies survived to fight another day and eventually made peace. The human cost of Kadesh is unknowable. Ancient sources don't provide casualty figures we can trust. Egyptian texts claim Rameses killed thousands personally, which is propaganda. Hittite texts don't discuss their casualties, which suggests they were significant enough to be embarrassing. Modern estimates range from 2,000 to 10,000 killed on both sides, but these are educated guesses at best. What we do know is that thousands of soldiers, Egyptian and Hittite, marched to Kadesh and didn't return. They were killed by chariots, spears, arrows, trampled by horses, drowned in the river trying to escape, or died of wounds afterward. Each one was somebody's son, brother, father. Each one had trained for years, marched hundreds of miles, and died in a battle that ultimately changed nothing. The soldiers on both sides were professionals. This wasn't citizen militia fighting for home and family. These were career military men who served for pay, plunder, and social advancement. They followed orders, fought bravely or fled depending on circumstances, and became statistics in their rulers' propaganda. The Egyptian soldiers who broke and ran from the chariot charge weren't cowards. They were human beings facing unstoppable force and choosing survival over pointless death. The Hittite chariot warriors who dismounted to loot weren't undisciplined barbarians. They were following ancient military practice where plunder was expected compensation. The fact that it nearly cost them victory shows the tension between military discipline and economic reality in ancient armies. Soldiers needed to be paid somehow, and battlefield plunder was a standard payment method. The officers on both sides, the commanders making tactical decisions in the chaos of battle, faced impossible choices with incomplete information. Should I stand and fight or withdraw? Should I commit reserves or hold them back? Should I pursue or consolidate? Every decision could mean the difference between victory and disaster, life and death for hundreds of men. They made the best choices they could with what they knew. Some chose well, others didn't. Rameses lived another 66 years, after Kadesh, dying in 1213 BC at around 90 years old. He ruled Egypt for 67 years, one of the longest reigns in Egyptian history. He built more monuments, fought more wars, and became known to history as Rameses the Great. The battle that nearly killed him in his 20s became a centerpiece of his propaganda throughout his reign. He never admitted it had been anything less than a spectacular victory. Muwatalli died around 1272 BC, about 15 years after Kadesh. His reign had been defined by conflict with Egypt. He succeeded in holding Kadesh and maintaining Hittite control of Syria. He didn't destroy the Egyptian threat, but he contained it. His brother Hattusili eventually overthrew Muwatalli's son and made peace with Rameses, ending the conflict that Kadesh had failed to resolve. The city of Kadesh itself remained strategically important for another century before declining into obscurity. It changed hands several times in subsequent conflicts. Eventually, the Bronze Age collapse destroyed the palace economies and trade networks that made it valuable. By 1000 BC, Kadesh was abandoned. Today, it's an archaeological site called Tel Nebi Mend in Syria, partially excavated but not fully explored. The chariots that clashed at Kadesh belonged to a transitional moment in military history. They represented the peak of Bronze Age warfare, the ultimate expression of palace economy military power. Within 2 centuries, that world would collapse. The empires that fielded thousands of chariots would fall. New peoples with new technologies and tactics would emerge. But the lessons of Kadesh endured. How to coordinate large forces, how to use intelligence and deception, how to combine different weapon systems, how terrain and timing affect outcomes, how propaganda shapes historical memory. These lessons, learned in blood on the plains of Syria in 1274 BC, would be relearned by countless commanders across the centuries. Infantry, which nearly died at Kadesh, survived and evolved. Soldiers learned to face chariots and prevail. The psychological barrier was broken. The aristocratic warriors in their expensive machines were no longer invincible gods of war. They were mortal men in expensive equipment, powerful but not unstoppable. That realization changed ancient warfare forever. When Greek hoplites faced Persian chariots at Marathon in 490 BC, they stood their ground and won. When Roman legionaries encountered Celtic chariots in Britain, they developed tactics to neutralize them. When medieval knights faced longbows at Crécy, the pattern repeated. Expensive aristocratic warriors on expensive mounts defeated by well-trained common soldiers who learned to stand firm and fight smart. This is Kadesh's real legacy, not the propaganda about heroic pharaohs or the tactical details of chariot charges. The real legacy is the eternal military truth that no weapon is invincible, no advantage is permanent, and victory comes not from superior equipment alone, but from training, discipline, coordination, and the willingness to adapt when circumstances change. The infantry learned to survive at Kadesh. Eventually they learned to prevail. The age of the chariot would end. The age of the disciplined foot soldier was beginning. It would take centuries to fully unfold, but the seeds were planted on that battlefield in 1274 BC when common soldiers discovered they could face the aristocratic warriors' unstoppable machines and live to tell about it. That's the story they didn't carve on temple walls, but it's the one that mattered. The broader context of Kadesh reveals why chariot warfare had become so dominant in the first place. Around 2000 BC, someone in the Near East, probably in the region of modern Syria or eastern Anatolia, figured out how to build a lightweight two-wheeled vehicle that could be pulled by horses at high speed. This doesn't sound revolutionary until you understand what came before. Earlier vehicles were heavy four-wheeled carts pulled by oxen or donkeys, slow, cumbersome, useful for transport but useless in combat. The innovation wasn't just wheels, it was the entire system. Spoked wheels instead of solid wheels, reducing weight by 70%. A lightweight wooden frame using bent wood techniques. A yoke system that distributed pulling force efficiently across two horses. And crucially, the breeding of horses large enough and strong enough to pull the vehicle at speed while remaining controllable. Each component required generations of technological refinement. The chariot was Bronze Age high technology, as sophisticated in its context as a fighter jet in ours. The military implications were immediately obvious. Suddenly, you could move warriors across the battlefield at 20 miles per hour. You could strike anywhere, retreat before counterattack, and redeploy faster than infantry could react. The composite bow, another technological marvel of the period, turned chariots into mobile missile platforms. An archer on a moving chariot was harder to hit and could rain arrows on enemy formations from multiple angles. The Egyptians perfected this combination. Their chariots were built for speed and maneuverability. Their composite bows could shoot accurately at full gallop. Their tactics emphasized mobility and firepower over mass and shock. The Hittites took a different approach. Their chariots were heavier, designed to smash into enemy formations and break them through sheer impact. The three-man crew with a dedicated spearman reflected this doctrine. After the initial charge scattered enemy infantry, the spearman would engage survivors in close combat, while the driver maneuvered and the archer provided cover. Hittite tactics were about overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. Mass your chariots, hit hard, break through, exploit the gap. Both approaches were devastatingly effective against infantry of the period. Bronze Age infantry were light troops by later. Standards, spears, small shields, minimal armour for most soldiers. They fought in relatively loose formations that allowed mobility but provided little protection against concentrated attack. A chariot charge hitting these formations was like a truck hitting a crowd of pedestrians. The physics were brutal. Horses weighed half a ton each. The chariot added another 300 pounds. Moving at 15 to 20 miles per hour, the kinetic energy was enormous. Infantry didn't just get knocked down, they got crushed, trampled, and scattered. The psychological dimension was equally important. Humans have instinctive fear responses to large animals moving at speed. Horses thundering toward you trigger deep survival instincts that override conscious control. Training could mitigate this somewhat, but never completely. Even veteran soldiers felt fear when chariots charged. The difference was that veterans had learned to control the fear, channel it into defensive actions, and trust that their formation might save them. Raw recruits just ran. Ancient military training emphasized this psychological preparation. Egyptian papyri described training methods where soldiers practiced formations, while trainers simulated chariot attacks by running at them with poles. or having actual chariots drive toward them at the last second veering away. The goal was desensitization. Make the terrifying become routine. Condition soldiers to hold formation even when every instinct screamed to run. It worked, but only partially. Training could prepare soldiers for chariots they saw coming. It couldn't prepare them for surprise attacks or being caught in disorganized formations. That's what happened to the Ra division at Kadesh. They were in marching formation, spread out, not prepared for combat. When 3,000 chariots hit them, training became irrelevant. There was no formation to hold, no officers giving orders that could be heard over the chaos, no possibility of organized defense. Individual soldiers made individual decisions to survive. Most died anyway. The few who made it to the Amun division's camp brought terror with them. Their panic was contagious, spreading through the camp faster than the Hittite chariots themselves. This is why ancient battles were so dependent on initial deployment and positioning. Once combat began, command and control collapsed. Officers couldn't communicate across the battlefield. Soldiers couldn't see beyond their immediate surroundings. The careful plans made before battle meant nothing once the fighting started. Victory went to whoever had better initial positioning and whose soldiers executed their training under impossible stress. Rameses had failed to position his army properly. His divisions should have been closer together, mutually supporting. Instead, they were isolated and vulnerable. The Egyptians weren't naive. They knew chariot tactics. They had fought the Hittites before and understood the threat, but Rameses had made a command decision to sacrifice security for speed. He wanted to reach Kadesh quickly, capture it, and secure his northern frontier before the Hittites could concentrate forces. The intelligence from the Bedouin deserters suggested he had time. He gambled on speed over security. The gamble failed catastrophically. This raises questions about ancient military leadership and decision-making. Rameses was young, 24, in his 5th year as pharaoh. He had been raised in the palace, trained in royal ideology that emphasized pharaonic supremacy and divine favor. His education included military training but not extensive combat experience. Egypt hadn't fought a major war in years. Rameses had political authority but limited practical battlefield experience. This is a dangerous combination. The confidence of authority without the caution of experience. His senior commanders were more experienced, veterans of smaller campaigns and border conflicts. They probably advised caution, slower advance, keeping divisions together. But in ancient monarchies, the king's word was absolute. If Rameses ordered rapid advance, his commanders obeyed regardless of their private concerns. This is one of monarchy's military weaknesses. Bad decisions by the supreme leader cannot be questioned or corrected by subordinates who know better. Mu'tali, by contrast, was an experienced ruler who had already been fighting Egypt for years. He had fought alongside his father before becoming king. He understood warfare not just as political theatre, but as practical problem-solving under uncertainty. His decision to use deception to hide his army and feed false intelligence to the Egyptians showed sophisticated strategic thinking. The execution of the ambush showed excellent staff work and coordination. Hiding 3,000 chariots and their supporting forces near Kadesh without Egyptian scouts detecting them required careful planning and discipline. The Hittite military system was different from Egypt's. The Hittite king commanded, but he relied heavily on experienced generals who controlled regional forces and allied contingents. The army at Kadesh included troops from across the Hittite Empire and allied kingdoms. Coordinating this multinational force required experienced officers who understood logistics, communication, and combined operations. Mu'tali had that experienced staff. Rameses, for all his advantages, didn't have the same depth of experienced leadership. This matters because ancient warfare was fundamentally about logistics and organization more than individual combat prowess. Getting 20,000 men to the battlefield was harder than fighting the battle. Feeding them, supplying them with weapons and equipment, maintaining discipline during long marches, coordinating movement of separate divisions, all this required extensive administrative machinery that only complex states could provide. Egypt had this machinery, so did the Hittite Empire, but machinery requires experienced operators. Egypt's military administration was excellent, but its leadership was young and overconfident. The supply requirements for Kadesh were enormous. An Egyptian soldier needed about 3 pounds of food daily, mostly bread and beer with occasional meat and vegetables. 20,000 soldiers required 30 tons of food per day. March from Egypt to Kadesh took about a month. so Egypt needed to transport or forage 900 tons of food for the infantry alone. The chariots required fodder for horses. Each horse ate about 20 pounds of grain and hay daily. With perhaps 2,000 horses for Egyptian chariots and transport, that's another 20 tons of fodder per day, 600 tons for the campaign. Weapons and equipment added more weight. Each soldier carried spear, shield, backup weapons, personal gear. Chariots needed spare wheels, axles, harness. Officers needed tents, furniture, administrative supplies. The total logistics train for an Egyptian army of 20,000 probably included at least 5,000 pack animals and hundreds of wagons carrying supplies. This enormous tail stretched for miles behind the fighting troops. It was vulnerable, slow-moving, and required its own security force. The Hittites faced similar logistical challenges but with advantages. They were defending their territory, so they could pre-position supplies at Kadesh. They didn't have to transport everything from distant Egypt. Their allied contingents brought their own supplies, distributing the logistical burden. And by hiding near Kadesh, rather than marching to meet the Egyptians in open territory, they minimized the time their forces needed to be supplied in the field. Strategic defense has logistical advantages. This logistical reality shaped tactical options. Ramesses couldn't afford to sit at Kadesh indefinitely besieging it. His supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to Egypt through potentially hostile territory. Every day his army remained in the field consumed supplies that had to be transported from home. He needed quick victory or withdrawal. The pressure to achieve rapid results contributed to his risky decision to advance quickly with divided forces. Muwatalli, operating near his supply base with prepared positions, could afford patience. He could wait for the perfect moment to attack. He didn't need to win quickly. He just needed to prevent Egyptian victory and inflict enough casualties to make continued campaign untenable. His strategic situation allowed defensive tactics that gave him enormous advantages. Ramesses' strategic situation forced offensive action that exposed him to those disadvantages. The battle's aftermath illustrates these realities. After the fighting ended, both armies remained in the region for perhaps another day before the Egyptians began withdrawing south, not retreating in panic, but conducting an organized withdrawal. The Hittites didn't pursue aggressively, suggesting they too had taken significant casualties and weren't confident in their ability to destroy the remaining Egyptian forces. Both sides had fought to exhaustion. Ramesses withdrew not because he was defeated militarily in the narrow sense. He still had two relatively intact divisions and his chariot force, but because his strategic situation had collapsed. He couldn't besiege Kadesh with a damaged army and uncertain supply lines. He couldn't remain in the field indefinitely, and most importantly, Egyptian prestige had been badly damaged. Word would spread about the disaster to the Ra division and the near destruction of the Amun division. Egyptian client states in the region would question Egyptian strength. Ramesses needed to return home, restore his reputation through propaganda, and rebuild his forces. The propaganda campaign began immediately. On the march back to Egypt, scribes were already composing the official account. By the time Ramesses reached his palace, the narrative was set. The king had faced impossible odds, been abandoned by cowardly troops, but through divine favour and personal heroism had triumphed over the Hittite multitudes. This wasn't just spin, it was necessary political theatre. Egyptian ideology held that Pharaoh was a living god whose victories proved divine favour. A defeat threatened not just military reputation, but the entire ideological foundation of Egyptian monarchy. The monuments Ramesses commissioned were extraordinary in scale and ambition. At Abu Simbel, Karnak, Luxor, the Ramesseum, and other sites, massive relief sculptures showed the battle in elaborate detail. These weren't simple propaganda. They were sophisticated visual narratives that combined historical event with mythological themes. Ramesses shown as larger than life, sometimes depicted with divine attributes, single-handedly defeating masses of tiny enemies. The artistic conventions emphasized not realistic representation, but ideological truth. Pharaoh's divine nature made him more than human. Therefore, he was shown larger than human scale. Modern viewers seeing these reliefs need to understand they weren't meant as documentary evidence. They were theological statements about kingship and divine favour presented through historical narrative. The ancient Egyptian viewers who saw them understood this context. They didn't literally believe Ramesses had killed thousands personally. They understood the images proclaimed that Pharaoh's victories came from divine support and that challenges to Egypt would fail because the gods favoured Pharaoh. The message was political, religious, and social all at once. The textual accounts, the poem of Pentor and the bulletin, were equally sophisticated propaganda. They were composed in high literary Egyptian using poetic forms and religious language. These weren't battlefield reports. They were literary works meant to glorify kingship and reassure Egyptian society that their divine monarch had protected them. The texts would be recited at temples, copied by scribes in training, and become part of Egyptian cultural memory. They succeeded brilliantly. For 3,000 years, Kadesh was remembered in Egypt as Ramesses' great victory. The Hittite response was more muted because Hittite ideology didn't require the same elaborate justification. Hittite kings were powerful rulers, but not divine beings like Egyptian pharaohs. They didn't need to prove divine favour through military victory in the same way. Mu'tali could claim victory simply by retaining control of Kadesh without elaborate theological justification. Hittite records mention the battle, but without the elaborate detail of Egyptian sources. This difference in sources creates historical problems because we're viewing events primarily through the distorting lens of Egyptian propaganda. Yet even the Egyptian propaganda accidentally reveals what actually happened. The emphasis on Ramesses fighting alone suggests he was isolated and his troops had fled. The mention of the Nearin's arrival suggests someone else helped turn the tide. The fact that Kadesh remained in Hittite hands afterward suggests the battle outcome was ambiguous at best. By reading what the propaganda tries to obscure, historians can reconstruct a more balanced account. The 16 years of continuing conflict after Kadesh showed that neither side had won decisively. If Egypt had truly triumphed as the monuments claimed, Kadesh would have fallen and Hittite power in Syria would have collapsed. If the Hittites had truly crushed the Egyptians, as some of their records suggested, Egypt wouldn't have been able to launch repeated campaigns into Syria over the next decade and a half. The stalemate demonstrated the limits of Bronze Age warfare. Neither empire could achieve the decisive victory that would end the conflict. This strategic stalemate had multiple causes. Distance was one. Egypt's power base was the Nile Valley, hundreds of miles from Syria. Projecting force that far was extremely difficult with Bronze Age logistics. Every mile from Egypt weakened Egyptian military power through supply line vulnerability and reduced reinforcement capability. Similarly, Hittite power was based in central Anatolia. Syria was their frontier too, far enough from their core territories that sustained offensive operations were challenging. Geography favoured defence. Both empires could defend their frontiers more easily than they could conquer enemy territory. Syria lay between them, a buffer zone that both claimed but neither could permanently control. Cities changed hands repeatedly through the Late Bronze Age. Sometimes Egyptian vassals controlled them, sometimes Hittite vassals did. The local rulers played both empires against each other, switching allegiance as circumstances warranted. This created perpetual instability that neither empire could resolve militarily. Economic factors also limited military options. Maintaining standing armies was expensive. Most soldiers were farmers during peacetime, mobilized for campaigns seasonally. A long campaign meant these farmers weren't working their fields, reducing agricultural production and tax revenue. Kings couldn't keep armies in the field indefinitely without economic collapse. This meant campaigns had to achieve objectives quickly or be abandoned. The failure to achieve quick victory at Kadesh doomed Ramesses' campaign regardless of tactical outcomes. The eventual peace treaty reflected these realities. Neither side could win, both faced other threats. Therefore, peace served both parties' interests. The treaty text is remarkable for its pragmatism. It established clear borders, ending the ambiguity that had caused decades of conflict. It created mutual defense pacts against common enemies. It included extradition clauses for fugitives and defectors. These were practical arrangements between powers that recognized each other's legitimacy and permanent presence. The ideological hostility of earlier years gave way to diplomatic realism. The marriage alliance between Ramesses and a Hittite princess sealed the peace through personal bonds. This was standard diplomatic practice in the ancient Near East. Royal marriages created family relationships between dynasties, making conflict more difficult. The Hittite princess who married Ramesses became an Egyptian queen, bearing the name Marthorn-Ferrer. She disappears from records after a few years, probably dying young, but her marriage symbolized the new relationship between former enemies. The peace lasted until the Hittite Empire collapsed during the Bronze Age crisis around 1200 BC. For over 50 years, Egypt and the Hittites maintained their alliance, cooperating against mutual threats. This peace was Kadesh's ultimate legacy. The battle that neither side won convinced both sides that continued war was pointless. Diplomacy achieved what warfare couldn't. But for military history, Kadesh's lessons extended far beyond immediate political outcomes. The battle demonstrated principles that would apply across centuries and cultures: the importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, the vulnerability of divided forces, the advantage of defensive positions and prepared ambushes, the limits of even superior weapons and tactics when facing determined opponents. These weren't unique to Kadesh, but were demonstrated there with unusual clarity because of the detailed if-biased sources. Later military theorists, from ancient times through the present, have studied Kadesh as a case example. Thucydides, writing about the Peloponnesian War centuries later, emphasized similar themes about preparation, positioning, and the role of chance in warfare. Sun Tzu's Art of War, roughly contemporary with Thucydides, stressed many principles illustrated at Kadesh. Know your enemy, control information, choose favorable ground, concentrate forces. These weren't lessons unique to any single battle but fundamental truths of warfare that Kadesh exemplified. The infantry's eventual triumph over chariot warfare took centuries but was inevitable once soldiers learned that chariots could be countered. The Greek phalanx, emerging around 700 BC, represented infantry's answer to mounted warriors. Heavy infantry in close formation with long spears could create a hedgehog that cavalry and chariots couldn't penetrate. The discipline required was enormous but achievable through systematic training. Greek city-states developed civic militias where citizen soldiers trained together regularly, creating cohesion and discipline that earlier armies lacked. The Roman legion perfected this evolution. Roman infantry combined discipline, training, standardized equipment, and tactical flexibility. They could fight in open order or close formation, attack or defend, adapt to terrain and circumstances. Roman soldiers were professionals who trained constantly and served for years. This created military effectiveness that Bronze Age armies couldn't match. Roman legions didn't fear cavalry or chariots. They had tactics, training, and equipment specifically designed to counter them. But we shouldn't imagine a linear progression from inferior ancient warfare to superior modern warfare. Ancient commanders, working within their technological and organizational constraints, were often brilliant. Muwatalli's ambush at Kadesh showed strategic sophistication that would impress modern military planners. The coordination required to position 3,000 chariots undetected, time the attack perfectly, and execute a complex battle plan demonstrates high-level staff work and battlefield command. Similarly, Ramesses's recovery from near disaster showed tactical flexibility and personal leadership. Whatever his earlier mistakes, his ability to rally broken troops and launch a counterattack while under tremendous pressure demonstrated real commandability. Many commanders would have panicked or fled. Ramesses stayed, fought, and preserved his army. That he then spent the rest of his life exaggerating his role doesn't diminish his actual performance in the crisis. The human dimension of Kadesh remains its most powerful aspect. Thousands of men, Egyptian and Hittite, marched to that battlefield knowing many wouldn't return. They did it anyway, because duty, honor, loyalty to comrades, economic necessity, or threat of punishment compelled them. The terror they felt when chariots charged was real. The pain when spears pierced flesh was real. The desperation of wounded men dying slowly in the sun was real. Ancient warfare was as brutal and horrific as modern warfare, sometimes more so because medical care was primitive, and death from wounds was common and lingering. The societies that sent these men to die were different from ours, but not incomprehensible. Egyptian and Hittite people loved their families, worried about their futures, took pride in their accomplishments, and feared death just as we do. The propaganda that glorified warfare and kings was similar to propaganda in any era. The gap between official narratives and actual experience was as wide then as now. Reading between the lines of ancient sources reveals people recognizable across millennia. Kadesh's commemoration in Egyptian monuments ensured its remembrance, but the meaning of that remembrance changed over time. To Ramesses' contemporaries, the monuments proclaimed pharaonic supremacy and divine favor. To later Egyptians, they became part of national mythology, stories of Egypt's greatness in the past. To modern historians, they're primary sources requiring careful interpretation and skepticism. To general audiences today, they're evidence of ancient propagandistic methods and the universal human tendency to reshape memory to serve present purposes. The battle site itself offers little evidence. Archaeological excavation at Tel Nebi Mend has revealed the Bronze Age city of Kadesh, but no battlefield artifacts. This isn't surprising. Battlefields were scavenged immediately after fighting. Weapons, armour, anything valuable was collected by the victors or by locals. Bodies were buried or left to decompose and scatter. After 3,000 years, nothing visible remains. The battle happened in the plain northwest of the city, but the exact location is uncertain, and the plain has changed through millennia of agriculture and development. Modern military analysis of Kadesh uses terrain studies, experimental archaeology, and comparison with other battles to understand what was possible and probable. Researchers have reconstructed Bronze Age chariots and tested their performance. Archers have tried shooting from moving chariots to understand accuracy and effectiveness. Historians have analysed similar battles from other cultures and periods to identify patterns and principles. This cumulative scholarship allows reasonable reconstructions even without physical battlefield evidence. The debate about Kadesh continues among scholars. Some emphasise the battle as proof of chariot dominance in Bronze Age warfare. Others stress it as early evidence of infantry adaptation and the beginning of chariot decline. Some view it as demonstrating Bronze Age logistical sophistication. Others see it revealing the limits of Bronze Age military systems. These aren't contradictory interpretations. Kadesh was complex enough that multiple valid analyses coexist. The battle demonstrated both chariot power and chariot limitations, both Bronze Age organisational achievement and its constraints. What's undeniable is the battle's significance within Bronze Age military history. It was the largest chariot engagement in ancient history. It involved the two dominant powers of the late Bronze Age at the peak of their strength. It occurred at a crucial moment when the Bronze Age system was mature but approaching crisis. Within a century, the Bronze Age world would collapse, the great palace economies would fall, and the warfare Kadesh exemplified would become impossible as the organisational and economic systems supporting it disintegrated. The Sea People's migrations and invasions around 1200 BC destroyed the Bronze Age world. The Hittite Empire collapsed completely. Egypt survived but diminished. The palace economy system that supported professional armies and chariot forces broke down. In the chaos, simpler military systems prevailed. Infantry became dominant by default because complex chariot forces couldn't be maintained. The Iron Age that followed was militarily less sophisticated initially, but eventually produced new systems that surpassed Bronze Age achievements. Kadesh thus represents a peak moment for a military system about to become obsolete. The chariots that ruled that battlefield would within generations be relegated to ceremonial roles or hunting. The palace economies that built them would collapse. The professional military systems would fragment. A dark age would descend where military technology and organisation actually regressed, before later recovering and advancing beyond Bronze Age levels. This makes Kadesh poignant in retrospect. The thousands of chariots clashing on that plain represented enormous investment in technology, training, and organisation that would soon become worthless. The commanders planning elaborate manoeuvres were practicing warfare that would become impossible within their grandchildren's lifetimes. The soldiers dying there were serving a world order about to collapse. They didn't know it. They fought and died in a present moment that seemed permanent, but was actually ending. That's always war's tragedy. Soldiers fight in the present for causes that may not survive into the future. The tactical brilliance or mistakes of commanders matter in the moment, but fade in significance against larger historical forces. Kadesh mattered deeply to those who fought there. It shaped their lives and ended many of them. But it didn't prevent the eventual peace between Egypt and the Hittites, didn't save the Hittite Empire from collapse, and didn't preserve the Bronze Age world order. What Kadesh did accomplish was demonstrating that even overwhelming military superiority isn't decisive without proper employment. The Hittites had superior intelligence, better positioning, larger forces, and achieved complete surprise. They should have destroyed the Egyptian army completely. That they didn't shows that warfare is irreducibly complex and uncertain. Even optimal conditions don't guarantee success. Human factors, chance, the unpredictable chaos of combat, all influence outcomes in ways that can't be fully controlled or predicted. This uncertainty is warfare's constant feature across all eras. Modern militaries with satellite surveillance, computer modelling and precision weapons still face fog of war and friction. Ancient commanders with limited communication and intelligence faced even greater uncertainty. That some managed to navigate this uncertainty successfully demonstrates genuine skill. That many failed despite competent planning demonstrates warfare's inherent unpredictability. The infantry that learned to survive chariot charges at Kadesh began a long evolution toward dominance, but it wasn't quick or linear. Chariots remained important for centuries in some regions. Cavalry eventually replaced chariots as the mobile strike force in ancient armies, and cavalry dominated for over a millennium. Infantry had to learn new tactics to counter cavalry, just as they had learned to counter chariots. The process repeated with each new military technology. Initial dominance, then adaptation, then counters, then parity. This cycle continues today. Every new weapon system initially seems game-changing, then adversaries develop counters, the advantage diminishes, parity returns until the next innovation. Bronze Age chariots, medieval knights, battleships, strategic bombers, nuclear weapons, all followed this pattern. Kadesh reminds us that military advantage is temporary. Tactics evolve, technology changes, and what seemed invincible becomes obsolete. The soldiers at Kadesh couldn't know their battle would be remembered 3,000 years later. They fought in the moment, dealing with immediate threats and challenges. Some performed heroically, some fled in terror. Most did what they were trained to do until circumstances overwhelmed them. Their individual stories are lost except for a few names preserved in Egyptian texts. But collectively, they participated in a moment that illuminated eternal truths about warfare, leadership, courage, fear, and the human capacity for both violence and survival. That's why Kadesh still matters. Not because it changed history dramatically, it didn't. Not because it demonstrated unique tactical innovations, it didn't really. It matters because it's so thoroughly documented that we can understand what ancient warfare actually involved. Behind the propaganda, beneath the mythologizing, we can glimpse real soldiers facing real danger, real commanders making life and death decisions under pressure, real armies struggling with logistics and organization, and all the mundane realities that determine whether grand strategic visions succeed or fail. The thunder of 3,000 chariots has been silent for 32 centuries. The soldiers who fought are dust. The empires they served are gone. The city they fought over is ruins, but the lessons remain. Know your enemy. Guard your intelligence. Keep your forces concentrated. Choose your ground carefully. Train your soldiers thoroughly. Expect the unexpected. And understand that in warfare, nothing is certain except that men will die, and survivors will reshape memory to serve present purposes. That's Kadesh. That's what the infantry learned there. That's what echoes across 3 millennia of warfare. The machines change, the tactics evolve, but the fundamental human dynamics remain constant. Fear and courage. Discipline and chaos. Planning and chance. Victory and defeat. Life and death. These constants transcend any particular battle or weapon or era. They're the eternal elements of warfare, demonstrated clearly at Kadesh and repeated endlessly throughout history. The chariots ruled that day, but infantry survived, and in surviving, they began the long process of learning to prevail.